The coffee was still warm when Sarah Chen stepped into the Michigan blizzard that swallowed Millbrook whole. Valentine's Day 2003, 9:47 p.m., and the storm was dumping nearly 14 inches across Gracie County, turning the quiet farming town into a white void that muffled sound and stole distance. From her kitchen window next door, Mrs. Elena Vance watched Sarah's red coat flicker like a signal flare in the wind, the borrowed mug cradled in her gloved hands, steam rising in thin ribbons that vanished as fast as the girl did. Mrs. Vance had waved, a faint silhouette behind cold glass. Sarah had lifted the mug in a playful salute, the blue and white checkered ceramic pattern matching the set Mrs. Vance had owned since the 70s. Then Sarah stepped from the warm glow of the porch light into the swirl of snow, her figure dissolving as though the night swallowed her whole. 47 minutes. That was all it took for a life to disappear. At 10:34, Sarah's boyfriend, Derek Martinez, called the Gracie County Sheriff's Department. His voice cracked, a rough mix of panic and disbelief. He told Deputy Wallace that Sarah had walked next door to return the mug, that he'd been waiting for her, that something felt wrong, terribly wrong, when she didn't come back. He'd gone to check on her, slogging through knee-deep drifts. Mrs. Vance told him Sarah had left almost an hour earlier. Derek had sprinted back across the narrow strip of snow-buried lawn that separated the houses, calling her name into a night too loud with wind to hear him back. Inside their small rental home, everything was exactly where Sarah had left it. Her purse on the kitchen counter, her keys beside it, her phone on the charger, her nursing textbooks spread across the dining table, highlighters left uncapped as though she planned to return in seconds, the front door locked from the inside, the deadbolt engaged, back door chain in place, windows sealed tight with the plastic sheeting Derek had installed in November. She hadn't gone anywhere, and yet she was gone. Deputy Wallace had worked rural law enforcement for 22 years. Disputes over property lines, snow-ditched vehicles, teenagers sneaking out after curfew. He'd handled missing persons reports before, kids running away, angry spouses cooling off at a friend's place. But the moment he stepped into Sarah's living room at 11:15 p.m., snow pounding the windows like fists demanding entrance, he felt something he couldn't name. The house felt wrong. Still, holding its breath. Sarah was everywhere and nowhere. Her scrubs draped over a chair, vanilla candles still burning on the mantel, her coffee mug in the sink. The life of a young woman going about an ordinary night. But the woman herself had vanished. In a town where everyone knew everyone, on a night so vicious that even the bar regulars had gone home early, Sarah's disappearance felt impossible, and impossible cases, Wallace knew, became nightmares. Across the state in Lansing, Linda Chen was preparing for her 6 a.m. shift at the Ford plant. Instant coffee, quick toast, the morning news murmuring in the background. When the phone rang, she almost didn't answer. Derek's voice barely made it through the speaker, hoarse from shouting into the storm for hours. Linda froze as he said the words no parent is ever prepared to hear. Sarah never came home. Linda's first instinct was denial. Sarah didn't miss appointments. Sarah didn't break routines. Sarah didn't disappear. Her daughter had endured too much to vanish without a trace. She'd been one of the only Asian American kids in rural Michigan, had lost her father at 16 to a factory accident, had worked 2 jobs to put herself through nursing school. Sarah was steady, reliable, the kind of person who called every Sunday and always sent flowers on Mother's Day. But as Linda drove the 87 miles north through unmoving traffic and unplowed roads, her denial froze and cracked. A cold certainty seeped in, colder than the February storm clawing at her windshield.
By noon, Linda had transformed Sarah's small rental house into a command center. Derek's gaming chair shoved aside, Gracie County maps spread across the dining table, red ink circles marking areas she insisted be searched. She called in sick to the plant, first time in 3 years, and then called back to explain she might need more time. She had learned that the system didn't save people like them. If Sarah was going to be found, Linda would have to be the one to find her. The first week of the investigation exposed fault lines that would define the next 16 years. Detective Raymond Ray Morrison, who'd left Detroit homicide for the slower rhythm of rural life, approached the case with skepticism. Young women didn't vanish from locked houses, he insisted. They had arguments, got overwhelmed, walked away from pressures. He questioned Derek relentlessly, poked at his financial issues, noted their occasional arguments, and reminded Linda that resources were limited. Winter weather complicated everything. Media attention could compromise things. Procedures mattered. Linda's faith in authorities cracked. She learned she was fighting 2 battles, one to find her daughter, another to convince law enforcement that Sarah mattered. Millbrook began dividing itself into factions. Posters went up, prayer circles formed, search parties grew then shrank. Meanwhile, whispers snaked through diners, churches, and hardware stores. Some said Derek had always seemed off. Some said Sarah staged it, overwhelmed by school. Some believed she'd simply walked away from small-town life. But none of them understood Sarah. As winter melted into March, Linda realized what no parent should ever have to accept. She was searching alone. Volunteers dwindled, leads dried up, and her daughter's trail grew colder by the hour. Still, Linda refused to stop. Because a mother doesn't stop. Not until she has answers. Not until she brings her child home. Even if every door in Millbrook remained locked. Even if every story contradicted the last. Even if her daughter had vanished into snow that left evidence behind, except for hers. Because the truth was chilling enough to haunt the town for 20 years. Sarah had walked toward her front door. Her footprints were clear, sharp, unmistakable. And then, 15 feet from safety, they simply ended.
Snow preserves secrets only briefly. Then, it buries them. Deputy Wallace knew this, yet even he couldn't explain what he saw the morning after Sarah vanished. The blizzard had died, sometime near dawn, leaving behind a landscape so untouched it looked sculpted. Every indentation, every ripple, every footprint should have meant something. Sarah's did, until they didn't. Wallace's department-issued camera clicked steadily, documenting every angle, every possibility. Derek's size 11 boot prints formed a frantic pattern around the house, a messy loop of desperation. Mrs. Vance's smaller tracks created a neat line between her back steps and the property edge. But Sarah's footprints, small, precise, her right foot angled outward from an old high school ankle injury, told a story that defied logic. She'd stepped from Mrs. Vance's yard into the rising snow, walked across the narrow strip toward her front door, and then, 15 feet from the porch, the impressions simply stopped. No drag marks, no signs of running, no disturbance from wind or drifting snow. Just an abrupt end, as if she'd been lifted straight into the storm-choked sky. State police technicians would later study the prints with rulers, probes, and a patience born from colder cases than this. They'd calculate snowfall rates, wind speeds, accumulation patterns. They would rule out plows, wildlife, storms, hoaxes. They would eliminate every explanation except the one no investigator wanted to write in a report. Sarah vanished on the spot. Inside the rental house, the scene was equally confounding. Sarah's planner lay open, V-Day dinner with D, written in blue ink still fresh enough to smudge. Soup half-eaten on the counter. Textbooks open to the cardiovascular system, notes in the margins, highlighters uncapped, like she'd been momentarily interrupted. Her coat,
bright red, unmistakable, hung in the bedroom closet. She'd gone next door without it. That detail would haunt Detective Morrison for years. Sarah stepped into a Michigan blizzard, wearing only a sweater and scarf. A 23-year-old nursing student who spent every winter in the Midwest would never walk outside unprotected unless she planned to return in seconds. So why hadn't she? In the days that followed, hope disintegrated into chaos. Tips flooded the sheriff's office, ranging from the ridiculous to the heartbreakingly plausible. A jogger claimed he saw a figure near the county line. False. A trucker swore a woman matching Sarah's description hitchhiked near Alma. Wrong. A gas station clerk in Bay City insisted she bought coffee and gas at midnight on the 15th. Another dead end. Morrison drove 130 miles with Linda Chen pressed silent beside him, both clinging to a thread of hope. The surveillance footage was grainy, the angles terrible. The woman looked like Sarah, same height, same dark hair pulled back, but her coat was navy, not red. Her gait was different. The clerk's certainty crumbled as he rewatched the footage. Linda stared so long her eyes burned. She wanted it to be Sarah, needed it to be. But it wasn't. And that truth crushed her.
The Bay City tip was only the first of many that would stretch across the Midwest. Chicago, Toledo, Madison, Detroit. Women who resembled Sarah lived entire lives unaware that their daily routines briefly resurrected Linda Chen's hope. Morrison followed every lead, every single one. He drove thousands of miles, interviewed hundreds of people, wore out 2 department vehicles in the process. But each hope flickered, then died. By August 2003, Sarah's case had expanded far beyond Gracie County. Morrison involved the state police, federal databases, regional alerts. But the same truth greeted him everywhere. No one had seen Sarah Chen. Derek became the investigation's immovable center. Morrison interviewed him 17 times in the first year. Not because he believed Derek was guilty, though pressure from above demanded a hard look, but because Derek was the last person to see her alive. He repeated the same story every time. Sarah left at 9:47. He waited by the living room window. The storm worsened. She didn't return. He checked next door. She wasn't there. He called the sheriff's department at 10:34. His polygraph? Inconclusive. His alibi? He was alone. His motive? There wasn't one. Derek's life collapsed anyway. Neighbors eyed him with suspicion. Search volunteers avoided his gaze. People whispered about the fights he and Sarah had, normal couple arguments, but magnified by tragedy. 3 weeks after the disappearance, unable to afford their shared rental alone, Derek moved back in with his parents in Grand Rapids. The moment he left Millbrook, half the town decided he was guilty by absence. Linda didn't believe that for a second. She'd watched the young man tear apart closets for the 100th time. She'd heard him scream Sarah's name into storms long after volunteers had gone home. She'd seen grief rip him apart, piece by piece. She didn't need a polygraph to read truth on a man's face. In March of 2004, 1 year after Sarah vanished, the sheriff's department quietly reclassified the case as cold. No announcement, no press conference, just a line in a report. Linda found out when she visited the sheriff's office and discovered her daughter's file was placed on a shelf behind dozens of newer cases. Morrison apologized. He tried to reassure her they'd still follow leads, but Linda saw what the label truly meant. Sarah was slipping from the system's memory. So Linda refused to let her slip from hers. She rented a tiny apartment in Millbrook. She canvassed neighborhoods alone. She photocopied flyers at the library until the staff started keeping an extra case of toner for her. She burned through her savings, her vacation time, her health. She stopped sleeping, stopped eating, stopped living. Except for Sarah. Every mother has a threshold where love becomes a mission. Linda reached hers before the snow melted. By 2005, Detective Ray Morrison was nearing retirement. Sarah's case weighed on him more heavily than he admitted. He'd handled homicides with clear motives, robberies with trails of evidence, assaults with witnesses. But Sarah's case had none of that. It gnawed at him. So when Detective James Jimmy Sullivan transferred in that fall, a seasoned investigator from the Michigan State Police, Morrison did what he'd never done before. He left the file on his desk, in plain sight, like bait. And Sullivan, intending only to familiarize himself with open cases, made a mistake that would shape the rest of his life. He opened the file, read the first page, looked at the first photograph, and felt the hook sink deep. Because Sarah's footprints didn't just end. They were cut off. As though someone had erased the rest of her path from the world.
Detective Jimmy Sullivan didn't believe in unsolvable cases. Not after 15 years with the Michigan State Police, where he'd unraveled murders held together by nothing more than a stray fiber or a half-forgotten witness. He'd transferred to Gracie County to escape that grind, not to inherit a mystery that defied every principle he lived by. Yet there he was, sitting alone in the evidence room at midnight, surrounded by boxes stenciled Chen, Sarah, 02/1403. The hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound in the concrete-walled basement. He told himself he was simply reviewing old work, getting up to speed, doing due diligence. But he kept coming back, night after night, drawn like a man to a gravity he didn't understand. He read statements until the pages softened from handling. He memorized timelines until he could recite them backward. He pinned the original crime scene photographs to the walls of his spare bedroom at home, turning it into a private war room. And always, his eyes returned to the final frame, Sarah's last footprint. A perfect impression, frozen in time, ending in nothing. Sullivan had seen staged crime scenes before, sloppy ones, clever ones, manipulative ones, but none like this. Whoever orchestrated it, if a person had orchestrated it, understood not only police procedure, but human psychology. How to distract, how to distort, how to confuse. Something about that terrified him. He began re-interviewing people, just to check boxes, he told himself. First, Mrs. Vance. Now in her 70s, her memory had softened around the edges, but her story hadn't changed a syllable. She'd waved goodbye. She'd turned back to her stove. She'd assumed Sarah walked the 30 steps home and made it there safely. Then Derek, who had rebuilt a quiet life in Grand Rapids, but carried guilt like a shadow. He answered every question without complaint. He still kept Sarah's nursing school photo on his dresser. And Linda, still living in Lansing again, still carrying a grief that fused with her bones. When Sullivan knocked on her apartment door, he looked at him with a mixture of hope and exhaustion that twisted something inside his chest. "Detective, tell me you found something." He hadn't. Not then. But obsession isn't always a spark. Sometimes it's a slow burn that consumes in silence. Within months, Sullivan's colleagues noticed the change in him. He missed court dates because he was recalculating snowfall data. He arrived late to briefings after driving rural back roads for hours, convinced he'd catch some detail hidden in the landscape. His refrigerator filled with stale takeout containers. He slept less and thought more. Sheriff Patricia Hayes, who'd hired him for his experience, became concerned. She'd seen Morrison lose pieces of himself to this case already. She couldn't afford to lose another detective to the same void.
"Jimmy," she warned one afternoon, leaning on his office doorframe, "you're slipping." "I'm working," he insisted. "You're unraveling." He didn't deny it, because she wasn't wrong. The breaking point came during a heavy snowstorm in January 2007, one eerily reminiscent of the night Sarah disappeared. Sullivan was reviewing the crime scene photographs again when something in the snow patterns caught his attention. A subtlety nobody had seen. A line in the drift that shouldn't have existed. Wind creates chaos. This was order, manipulated order. He spent 6 straight hours calculating wind direction, gust velocity, the angle of Sarah's body weight distribution based on the imprint depth. He filled pages with equations until his handwriting grew frantic. When he finally brought Sheriff Hayes' theory that the snow had been deliberately altered to cover evidence, she saw the mania in his eyes. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one consuming him. She had to make a decision: pull him off the case or let him chase the truth until it destroyed him. Removing him would risk losing the only man who still saw Sarah as a person rather than a file. She chose the middle path. Sullivan stayed on the case, unofficially, quietly, only when other work allowed. Enough to keep him functional, enough to keep him hopeful. Years passed. Tips dwindled. Evidence grew stale. Witnesses moved, died, forgot. And then in March 2019, 16 years after Sarah vanished, Detective Sullivan's phone rang. Dr. Angela Martinez from the Michigan State Police Forensic Lab had found something no one in 2003 could have imagined possible. The fibers collected from Sarah's red winter coat, tiny, near-weightless threads originally dismissed as inconclusive, had yielded a partial DNA profile thanks to updated extraction techniques. 13 genetic markers. Male. Meaning the fibers came from someone who'd physically touched Sarah's coat shortly before she disappeared. More surprising still, the lab detected a commercial-grade soap residue used almost exclusively in hospitals, large schools, government buildings, places with industrial cleaning systems. Sullivan's pulse roared in his ears. A male DNA donor, with access to institutional cleaning supplies, with some form of physical contact with Sarah, 16 years earlier. This wasn't a ghost, not a rumor, not a theory. This was science. He thanked Dr. Martinez, hung up the phone, and sat motionless for a long time. After 16 years of chasing shadows, the first tangible thread of truth had finally appeared. Sullivan didn't sleep that night, or the next, or the one after. He began the slow, grueling process of identifying every person who might match the criteria. Sarah's nursing rotations had brought her in contact with dozens of hospital employees, security guards, cleaning crews, maintenance staff, administrative workers. Her part-time job in medical supply distribution had introduced her to delivery drivers, warehouse staff, regional reps. And then there were the people interviewed in the original investigation, neighbors, acquaintances, bystanders, any of whom could have brushed against her that night. He created a database, cross-referenced names with employment records from hospitals and institutions that used commercial cleaners. 13 people met all criteria. He approached each with caution. He couldn't demand DNA, but he could ask. He could collect discarded items. He could wait. 8 gave samples willingly. All cleared. 3 couldn't be found. 1 had died. 1 remained. The last file was thin. Only a brief interview from 2003. A name Sullivan barely remembered from the earliest witness lists. Robert or Bob Vance. Age then, 52. Occupation, maintenance supervisor at Gracie County Medical Center. Connection, nephew of Mrs. Elena Vance.
Sullivan requested his DNA. The lab returned the result with a single earth-shifting sentence. Perfect match. 13 out of 13 markers. 16 years after Sarah disappeared, the first piece of truth had a name, and that name belonged to a man who had been there all along. When the name Robert Bob Vance appeared on Detective Sullivan's computer screen, something inside him went still. A quiet, icy stillness, like the surface of a frozen lake just before it cracks. Bob Vance wasn't a stranger, not some forgotten name buried deep in old notes. He'd been part of Sarah's world that night. A familiar face, a trusted presence. Mrs. Vance's helpful nephew, the man who stopped by to shovel her walk, fix her furnace, carry groceries during storms. Every neighbor knew him. Every church member nodded to him on Sundays. He'd even joined the early search parties for Sarah, walking fields and wooded edges with quiet determination. He'd comforted Derek, he'd offered Linda condolences. He'd stood close enough to grief that no one ever imagined grief might be close to him. But the lab results were absolute. 13 genetic markers. No doubt, no ambiguity. The fibers from Sarah's coat belonged to Bob. Sullivan stared at the match confirmation until the screen blurred. He read the report again and again, his heart pounding as if trying to outrun his thoughts. Bob worked in maintenance at the Gracie County Medical Center. Commercial-grade cleaners were used there. He lived only a few miles from Sarah's rental house. He had unrestricted access to his aunt's home, and he was present, physically present, on the night Sarah returned that mug. Sullivan dug into Bob's old interview from 2003. It was short, barely a page and a half, the kind of routine courtesy questioning detectives perform when canvassing neighbors. Bob had claimed he was at his aunt's house that night to help her prepare for the blizzard, checking windows, delivering groceries, making sure the furnace worked. It made sense. It fit his reputation, and Mrs. Vance had confirmed it. But now, what once felt harmless began to feel sinister. Sullivan reviewed hospital staffing logs from February 2003. Bob had been working late shifts during the weeks leading up to Sarah's disappearance. He had access to maintenance trucks, he had keys to storage rooms, he had reasons to be out at odd hours. No one ever questioned him beyond that one interview. Why would they? Bob Vance wasn't the type. He was the man who fixed your leaky faucet and cleared your gutters in the fall. He was safe, predictable, dependable.
He was exactly the person a young woman wouldn't fear. That realization chilled Sullivan more than the blizzard ever had. He dug deeper. Staff at the medical center were hesitant at first. Bob was well-liked, respected even, but subtle patterns emerged. Several young women recalled Bob asking questions that felt a little too personal. Where do you live? Do you walk to your car alone? What time do your clinical shifts end? They had dismissed the awkwardness as harmless, a lonely older man grasping for connection. Now those questions took on a darker shape. Sullivan's investigation found no criminal record. Aside from minor citations, Bob was spotless, but spotless records can hide rot beneath the surface. Something else stood out: Mrs. Vance's behavior. In 2017, she'd moved into a nursing home. Staff there reported moments, fleeting, disjointed, when she seemed afraid of her nephew. She'd mutter to herself, whispering fragments, secrets, things Bob said not to tell. Don't open that door. Her dementia made her unreliable, but Sullivan couldn't shake the feeling that her memory held pieces of the truth trapped beneath the fog. For the first time in 16 years, the case was no longer theoretical. It was personal, tangible, dangerous. On April 8, 2019, Sullivan began surveillance. He parked his unmarked sedan across the street from Bob's tidy two-bedroom house. The curtains were never fully closed. Sullivan could see the flicker of a TV screen, the silhouette of a man sitting alone in a recliner. Bob's routine was clockwork. Leave home at 6 a.m., clock in at the medical center at 6:22, leave at 3:30 p.m., home by 3:45, lights off at 10. Predictable. Controlled. The habits of a man who needed order. But now Sullivan saw the cracks. Bob dropped keys twice before getting the front door open. His garbage bins overflowed with empty whiskey bottles, something coworkers said he didn't drink. His lawn, normally trimmed to near perfection, grew patchy. And then there were the cemetery visits. Bob had always visited his aunt's grave on Sundays, a quiet ritual, no cause for alarm. But now he went daily, sometimes twice. He knelt at the headstone for long periods, shoulders shaking, lips moving in silent confession. Sullivan watched through a telephoto lens, his chest tightening. Guilt, he thought. Or fear. Maybe both. Sullivan couldn't confront Bob yet, not without understanding the full picture, not without considering what an unstable, cornered man might do. He had to apply pressure gradually, piece by piece. The first interview took place at the medical center on April 15th. Sullivan framed it as routine, part of a cold case review focusing on all original witness statements. Bob agreed readily, too readily. He sat in his supervisor's office, hands clenched, eyes shifting toward the door every few seconds. A man waiting for escape. A man expecting something. When Sullivan asked about the night of February 14th, 2003, Bob's answers were consistent with his old statement, but something in his voice trembled. He added details no one had requested, unnecessary explanations, attempts to preempt suspicion that had not yet been expressed. Classic guilt behavior. 3 days later, Sullivan returned. He revealed a new detail. We've extracted DNA from fibrous found on Sarah's coat. He didn't say whose. He didn't say what it meant. He just watched. The reaction was immediate. Bob's face drained of color, his breathing sped up, his hands shook uncontrollably. He excused himself, went to the restroom, where Sullivan could hear him vomiting. When he returned, he was pale, sweating, unraveled. The third interview came on April 22nd. This time Sullivan didn't ease into it. He said quietly, "Bob, the DNA is a match. Not accusatory, not threatening, just factual." Bob stared at him, eyes wide, pupils blown, panic rising like a tide. And then the dam broke. His voice cracked, his jaw trembled. He whispered, "I never meant for it to happen. Sarah, she didn't deserve what I did." The confession poured out in fragments, choking sobs, long silences where his mind re-entered that night. 16 years of buried truth clawed its way to the surface. He told Sullivan that he'd followed Sarah home. He told him there was a struggle. He told him she'd hit her head. He told him she died. And then he told him something far worse. "I took her someplace safe, a place she could rest." But when Sullivan asked where, his voice collapsed into incoherent, grief-stricken rambling. "The place with water, where the old oak watches, where she wouldn't be cold." It wasn't enough to find her. Not yet. The truth was coming, but the final, shattering pieces were still buried, just like Sarah. Millbrook didn't know how to process the news. A town that prided itself on neighborliness, on potluck dinners and borrowed tools and driveway snowblowings, suddenly found itself staring into a mirror it didn't recognize. Bob Vance, quiet, helpful, trustworthy Bob, had confessed to killing Sarah Chen. The shock rolled through the community like an earthquake with endless aftershocks. At Rosie's Diner, where folks once argued whether Derek or the storm was to blame, no one spoke above a whisper. At First Baptist, people stood in the parking lot long after Sunday service, staring at one another with wide, uncertain eyes. And in the grocery store checkout line, neighbors who had known Bob for decades avoided mentioning his name at all. Because if Bob could do this, what else had they missed? Who else had they misjudged? What did they no longer know about the people around them? The arrest tore through old assumptions like lightning striking a dead tree.
But for Linda Chen, the news did not bring relief, just a new, unbearable kind of grief. When Sullivan called her that morning, she listened, unmoving, as he told her that Bob had confessed. Not in detail, not coherently, but enough. Enough to confirm what Linda had feared and refused to speak aloud for 16 years. Her daughter had been killed. When she hung up, she stayed at her kitchen table for a long time. Her coffee went cold. The morning sun crept slowly across the linoleum floor. Her breathing stayed shallow, as though her body feared what would happen if she allowed herself a full, unrestrained breath. All those years, all those flyers, all those sleepless nights, all the searching in woods and fields and ditches, all the strangers who called with false hope, all the birthdays and holidays where she set out 2 place settings instead of 1, just in case. 16 years holding on. 16 years refusing to give up. Now she knew the truth, and it hollowed her. She didn't cry right away. She didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She sat quietly, as though waiting for something inside her to catch up. Then, when she finally stood and walked to her bedroom, she saw Sarah's last photograph pinned to her mirror, the one taken before her nursing orientation, her hair pulled back, her smile small and full of promise. That's when she broke. She sank to the floor, gripping the comforter, a sound escaping her that didn't sound human, a sound that came from a place grief had carved out deep inside her. Linda had always imagined justice would bring warmth.
Instead, it chilled her to the bone. Bob's confession was incomplete, full of shadows and distortions, the mind of a man unraveling under the weight of what he'd done. Detectives needed clarity, but every question seemed to fracture him further. At first, he claimed Sarah slipped on the kitchen floor. Then he said she'd fallen backward onto the counter. Later, he insisted she stumbled during a struggle. Sometimes he said she lost consciousness instantly. Other times, he insisted she spoke to him before dying. The story changed each time. The guilt remained constant. He sobbed. He apologized. He held his head in trembling hands as though trying to keep the memories from escaping. But there were parts of his confession that never wavered. He admitted he'd followed Sarah home to help her through the storm. He admitted he used his aunt's spare key. He admitted Sarah rejected him. He admitted he panicked. He admitted she died. And he admitted that he staged the scene. He described walking back through the snow, deliberately stepping only where Sarah had stepped. He chose his exit route carefully, squeezing through the basement window to avoid disturbing the main doors. He knew how to lock it from the outside using a tool from his maintenance kit. Then he used a broom handle to erase the traces of his own boots in the drifts, except for the section where he preserved hers. He wanted it to look impossible, Bob whispered. Like she disappeared on her own, like she faded. He said it with a tremor of pride, then flinched at hearing his own tone. It struck Sullivan like a punch. Bob had studied crime scenes. He had studied investigators. He had studied people. For years. Sullivan had seen predators with plans before, but this was different. Bob wasn't a clever criminal. He was an ordinary man who'd stepped into darkness and then spent 16 years covering it up. And the worst part, the part that haunted Sullivan, was that he almost got away with it. If technology hadn't advanced, if the fibers hadn't been preserved, if the lab hadn't worked that backlog, if Sullivan had given up, Sarah's story might have ended with an empty case file buried in a basement drawer. But now they had Bob. What they didn't have was Sarah. And until they did, the case wasn't over. Sullivan pressed Bob carefully, asking for locations, creeks, woods, fields, basins. But Bob's mind drifted, his memories fogged by time and guilt. She's somewhere peaceful, he repeated again and again. Near water, under the old oak. There were dozens of old oaks in Gracie County. Hundreds of bodies of water. Thousands of acres of farmland and woods. They needed specifics. Search teams mobilized quickly. State police, county deputies, volunteers, cadaver dogs trained for deep soil detection, ground-penetrating radar, aerial drones, topographic maps, historical surveys. They started with the areas Bob mentioned first: Millbrook Creek, the old quarry pond, the forested wildlife corridor south of town. But every search ended the same way: empty. Linda accompanied them whenever she was allowed. She stood at the edges of fields with her hands clasped under her chin. She walked creek beds in silence. She traced tree bark with trembling fingers, as if touching enough surfaces might lead her to the one Sarah rested under. Each time the teams packed up equipment and loaded into vehicles, Linda lingered. "She's here somewhere," she'd whisper. "My girl is here." Her voice never sounded angry, just resolute, unbreakable, like a woman who'd survived the worst already. But Sullivan felt a growing dread. He feared Bob's memory might be too broken, too vague, too warped by guilt. He feared they might never find Sarah. Meanwhile, Millbrook turned inward, trying to reconcile reality with the illusion they had lived under for years. People remembered Bob fixing leaky pipes, changing furnace filters, helping carry groceries, painting church railings, teaching Sunday school crafts. Everything he had ever done now felt tainted. How did we miss it? People asked each other. No one had an answer. Fear filled the vacuum where certainty once lived. Parents double-checked locked doors. Neighbors watched one another differently. Women stopped going out at dark alone. Old friends grew cautious. Because Bob had not been a stranger, he had been one of them. Good, reliable, familiar. And that realization was almost as frightening as Sarah's disappearance had been. Because if Bob Vance could hide a monster inside a man, maybe anyone could. But the truth wasn't finished with Millbrook, and Sarah's story wasn't done. Pieces of memory, broken, twisted, half-buried, still waited in the corners of Bob's mind, and Sullivan, who had spent 16 years chasing a ghost, knew the final answers would come from only one place: the man who had kept them secret for nearly 2 decades. In the days following Bob Vance's arrest, Detective Sullivan found himself trapped in a strange kind of limbo, equal parts victory and dread. He had solved the impossible. He had uncovered the truth behind a disappearance everyone believed would remain a mystery forever. But the truth wasn't a finish line. It wasn't even close. Because Sarah was still missing, and closure meant nothing without her. Bob's confession played in Sullivan's head like a frayed tape, distorted, skipping, circling back on itself. Sometimes Bob claimed Sarah fell. Other times he described a struggle. Sometimes he insisted he panicked. Other times he hinted at intent he later denied. The details changed, but the outcome never did. And then there was the issue of her body. Bob insisted he'd placed her somewhere she could rest, but his description was maddeningly vague. Water, trees, an old oak, a place he said he knew well. Sullivan needed specifics, and he knew only one way remained to extract them. He had to push Bob further. Not aggressively, not harshly, carefully, surgically. Because Bob's mind was cracking, and if it shattered completely, Sarah might never be found. Sullivan scheduled another interview on April 29th. Bob had been in jail 5 days, and the weight of confinement was already showing. His once steady hands shook constantly. His eyes darted toward corners as if expecting shadows to speak to him. His voice, once soft and measured, had developed a stutter, born from fear or guilt. Sullivan wasn't sure which. The interview room felt colder than usual.
The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A metal table separated them. "Bob," Sullivan began gently, "I need you to help us find Sarah." Bob swallowed hard, his fingers twisted into each other, knuckles whitening. "I told you, she's somewhere peaceful." "Where?" Sullivan asked, leaning forward just slightly. "Help me understand." Bob squeezed his eyes shut. "The water," he whispered. "Where the water runs quiet. Millbrook Creek, the Quarry Pond, the old irrigation basin?" Bob shook his head rapidly as though the suggestions were physically painful to hear. No, not those." "Then where, Bob?" For several long seconds Bob didn't speak. His shoulders quivered, his breath tremored. Sullivan waited, letting silence stretch, not as a threat, but as an invitation. Finally, Bob whispered, "She's near the tree." "What tree?" "The old one. The one that watches." Sullivan's pulse quickened. The old oak. It wasn't much, but it was a start.
"Where is it?" Sullivan asked. But Bob's eyes fluttered open in panic. I can't say more. I promised." "Promised who?" Bob stared at the table with unfocused eyes. "Promised myself." And just like that, he withdrew into silence again. The search teams expanded. Gracie County had more old oaks than anyone could count, some standing alone in wide-open farmland, others buried deep in forgotten woods. Sheriff Hayes coordinated with state search and rescue units, bringing in K-9 handlers and drone operators. They focused first on areas Bob might know well: routes between his home and the medical center, land near his aunt's property, wooded patches near familiar fishing spots. Days turned into a week into 2. Every search ended empty-handed, but Sullivan refused to accept defeat. If Bob's mind was fractured, then the truth was likely fragmented, not gone. He had to look between the pieces. He revisited Bob's employment logs, his driving routes, his old fishing licenses, his hunting permits, his property tax records, his medical center maintenance requests, every blueprint he'd ever worked with, every facility he had keys to. Then, he found something. A logbook entry from February 12, 2003, 2 days before Sarah vanished. Bob had been called to repair a frozen pipe at Millbrook Drain Station Number 3, a small rural water management site 6 miles outside town. It sat near a narrow tributary that fed into Millbrook Creek. The property was scattered with storage sheds, abandoned equipment, and, according to a satellite image, one enormous solitary oak tree standing guard near the water's edge. Sullivan felt the hairs on his arms rise. A place with water, a place with an old oak, a place Bob had visited days before Sarah disappeared, a place isolated enough to hide anything. He didn't tell the search team immediately, not before confirming it himself. He drove out before dawn the next morning. The road was unpaved, full of potholes and spring mud. The sky was a bruised gray, the kind that promised rain. When he reached the clearing, his headlights swept across the landscape. The drainage station was small, just a concrete pump house and a rusted metal shed. But the oak tree was enormous, towering, ancient. Its branches stretched wide, thick with early spring buds. The ground beside it moved slowly, almost reverently. A place she could rest. Sullivan stepped into the dew-soaked grass, the air cool enough to sting his lungs. He walked toward the tree. The ground was unremarkable at first. Wild grass, scattered leaves, patches of old roots. Then he saw it. A depression in the soil. Subtle. Maybe a foot wide, maybe less. Hardly noticeable to anyone not looking for it. But Sullivan was looking for it. He knelt, pressed his fingers into the earth. The ground felt different. Softer. Disturbed. Soil that had been moved, then resettled. He stood and called Sheriff Hayes. "We found something," he he said. "Bring everyone." Within hours, the area transformed from quiet clearing to coordinated excavation site. Deputies marked off a 30-foot radius around the oak. Canine dogs circled, noses to the ground, tails stiffening. Ground-penetrating radar scanned layers of soil, sending back images that made the technicians exchange glances. Then one of the dogs alerted. Sharp, focused, certain. The excavation team began its careful work. Foot by foot, inch by inch, layer by layer. Sullivan stood back, hands trembling at his sides. Linda Chen arrived minutes later, escorted by a deputy. She moved slowly, as if each step was made of glass. "Sullivan," she whispered, voice breaking, "is it—" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. She saw the reverence on the team's faces. She saw the flags marking the soil. She saw the ancient oak watching over the earth below. For a moment she closed her eyes. Then she stepped closer, not afraid, not hesitant, ready. Ready for what she had both dreaded and prayed for. 2 hours later, the digging stopped. A hush fell over the clearing. A small fragment of red fabric emerged from the soil, preserved in the cool, packed earth. Red, like the coat she hadn't worn that night. Linda Chen fell to her knees. Sullivan closed his eyes. After 16 years, they had found her. Sarah Chen had come home. But the story wasn't finished. There was still the final truth, Bob's full confession, the trial, and the town's reckoning.
The clearing fell silent after that first glimpse of red, utterly, devastatingly silent. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if the world itself understood the weight of that moment. The excavation team moved with reverence now, easing the soil away like pages of a long-lost book. Beneath the earth, protected from the harsh Michigan winters, by layers of clay and roots, they found what had been taken 16 years earlier. Sarah. Not as she had been, bright, driven, 23, but as she had become. Evidence of a crime, the center of a mystery, the anchor of a mother's unbroken hope. Linda knelt beside the flagged perimeter, hands covering her trembling mouth. She didn't cry at first. She didn't move. She simply stayed, steady, present, bearing witness to the moment she'd spent half her life preparing for. Detective Sullivan stood several yards back, jaw tight, hands clenched at his sides. This was the closure he'd chased for more than a decade, yet it felt nothing like victory. It felt like loss, like gravity, like an ending wrapped in a kind of grief he'd never experienced. When the medical examiner approached Linda, gently asking if she wanted to step away, she shook her head. "No," she whispered. "My daughter was alone long enough." Those 6 words cracked something inside everyone who heard them. The recovery process took hours. Sarah's remains were carefully placed into a transport case lined with soft fabric, an act of respect more than necessity. When the team finally lifted her from the earth, Linda rose to her feet, one hand pressed against her heart. Sullivan turned away briefly, eyes burning. Bob Vance had said he'd chosen a peaceful place. Sullivan had resented the sentiment when Bob first uttered it, but standing beneath the ancient oak, hearing the soft rush of the creek nearby, he understood the cruel truth. Bob hadn't hidden Sarah in malice. He'd hidden her in guilt, in fear, in cowardice. But he had still hidden her. And now that cowardice would face the weight of everything uncovered beneath that tree. Bob was transported from county jail to a secure psychiatric observation cell after the discovery. His mental state, already fragile, fractured further when news broke that Sarah had been found. He shook, he wept, he muttered to himself,
He asked if the oak still stood. When Sullivan entered the observation room 2 days later, Bob looked up with hollow, almost childlike eyes. "You found her," he whispered. "Yes, we did," Sullivan replied. Bob's lower lip quivered. I thought she'd stay hidden. I couldn't stand the idea of—" His words dissolved into a sob. Sullivan didn't soften. "You took her life, Bob." "I know. And every day afterward—"
The statement, disturbing in its quiet sincerity, confirmed what Sullivan had suspected. Bob's guilt had been eating him alive for 16 years. "What happened that night?" Sullivan asked. "The truth, Bob. No more fragments." Bob closed his eyes and inhaled shakily. "I followed her," he murmured. "I just wanted to talk. I didn't mean to scare her. She looked so cold walking in that storm. I thought if I helped her to her door, she'd see I wasn't like the others." "What others?" Sullivan asked. Bob flinched, but he didn't answer. "She let me in when I told her I needed to check on my aunt's basement pipe," Bob continued. "She didn't want to be rude. She was kind, Detective. Too kind." He swallowed a tremor. "I tried to tell her how I felt. She told me she wasn't interested. She asked me to leave." His breathing hitched. "I panicked. She tried to get to the door. I grabbed her arm. She pulled back. She slipped." Sullivan's jaw clenched. "You hit her." "I didn't mean to," Bob cried out. "She fell. She hit her head on the counter, and she stopped moving." He broke down fully then, collapsing inward like a structure whose supports had been removed. Sullivan let the silence hang heavy between them. When Bob finally spoke again, his voice was barely audible. "I didn't know what to do, and then I started thinking about the shows, the ones where people get away with things. I shouldn't have watched them. I shouldn't have—" He buried his face in his hands. "And I made it look like she vanished." No remorse could rewind time. No confession could unbreak Linda Chen's heart. But it was the truth. And the truth mattered. The trial began 9 months later in early 2020. By then, the entire state of Michigan knew Sarah Chen's name. The courtroom overflowed daily. Local reporters jostled for space with national outlets. And yet inside the wood-paneled walls of Gracie County Circuit Court, the proceedings felt strangely intimate, a single story unfolding under the hard fluorescent lights. Bob pleaded guilty to second-degree murder as part of an agreement that spared Linda the agony of listening to every graphic detail in open court. He admitted the staging, admitted disposing of Sarah's body, admitted hiding the spare key he'd taken months earlier. The judge stared at him as he spoke, expression heavy. When sentencing came, Linda requested to address the court. She stood, small but unshakable, in a simple navy sweater. Her voice was steady, but every person in the courtroom felt the strength it took to speak each word. "You stole my daughter's life," she said, looking directly at Bob. "You stole her future, her dreams, her laughter. You stole 16 years of my life too." Bob lowered his head. "But you didn't steal everything," Linda continued. "Sarah lives in every person who searched for her, every volunteer who showed up in the cold, every detective who refused to quit. And she lives in me, even now." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. "I forgive you," she whispered. "Not because you deserve it, but because my daughter deserved peace long before today." A hushed gasp rippled across the courtroom. Even Sullivan closed his eyes, humbled. Bob choked on a sob, the first sound he'd made since she began speaking. The judge sentenced him to 42 to 70 years in the Michigan Department of Corrections. He would likely die there. The oak tree became a memorial. People left flowers, ribbons, letters, candles, photos. Sometimes Linda would visit at dawn, when the creek was still and the sky pale with first light.
She'd sit at the base of the oak, breathing in the quiet, believing in her heart that Sarah could hear her. Detective Sullivan visited too, not often, but enough. Enough to stand with the wind brushing past his shoulders, enough to feel the weight lighten, enough to know that some cases change you forever. He never stopped thinking about Sarah, or about Linda, or about the lesson the case carved into his life. It's not the mysteries that haunt us, it's the truths we almost never find. But this time, through heartbreak, through obsession, through 16 years of darkness, they found the truth. And they brought Sarah home.